Andrew Clay Shafer, everybody. Andrew Clay Shafer is the next one going to be up today. You're going to talk about DevOps contradictions. DevOps, the word DevOps is a contradiction. So right from there, we definitely contradictions in the world of DevOps, right? In the world of tech, we've spent, uh, you know, a lot of time trying to think about how to name things, and we name that incorrectly. Unfortunately, the introduction for this chat that I had for this presentation that I have in my scenario document is in fact Emily's. So I don't know what this talk is going to be about. So I'm just going to let Andrew take it over. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Well, that makes two of us that don't know. How's everyone doing? So I hope everyone's staying safe. I'm speaking from the relative comfort and safety of my house. So hopefully wherever you are and your family is in a safe place. I'm not sure if you can see my slides yet. I think there's on a Zoom shared. There we go. So this is, I was trying to think of something interesting and new to talk about, and hopefully this will hit the mark. And it's certainly something that I've witnessed, it's something I've experienced, and maybe it will resonate with you, maybe it won't. I think one thing I should work on is getting a little smarter, like Kelsey, and only doing firesides, but moving on, we'll go. So he said I didn't need an introduction, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about myself, but I've been involved in DevOps before that was really the word for it, and working on, system automation projects, open source projects, agile transformation projects for going back 15 years now. And I participated in writing some books, and there's lots of videos of me saying words similar to this online. So if you think anything I say is interesting today, maybe some of those other things will be interesting as well. So this is, I don't know, what the end of this movie is, but I feel like I'm starting to look a little bit like Doctor Strange with the gray streaks. And there's this kind of notion of multiple dimensions in some of the stuff I'm going to share today that might kind of resonate with the experiences you're having. I also want to just say what a privileged career I feel like DevOps has provided me over the span of this time, to be able to go around and participate in all these different projects, scope and scale, and everything from the startups to the enterprise. I've just been very privileged, and I feel like some of this is just circumstance and luck, and I was happy to be along for the ride. So with that, moving into this, I often like to have definitions. In fact, when I get in conversations about DevOps, I will often try to get the group to get a definition for that conversation. And that is because of some of the stuff we're talking about today. There's different definitions for different people, different personas, whatever word you want to use. We all have slightly different perspectives. We're all, quote unquote, touching the elephant in different places. So it behooves us, for the sake of the communication that we're having, to get to a shared metaphor, to a shared model for the vocabulary. And you can never be sure that communication actually happened. You can just do your part, do your effort to make sure that everyone's trying to use the words the same way. Because I assure you, one, that marketing ruins everything, and two, most people aren't always going to use the word the same way you do. So try to get to the understanding. Just for the sake of completeness, contradiction comes from the Latin to speak against, or the word means against and then to speak. So this is like, I like words and where they come from. I'm also a math nerd. We'll get to that too. So these are things I've heard people say. I've heard people say out loud, and sometimes in the same event, in the time and space, where DevOps is too focused on development or developers, and then in the same conversation or the same situation, that DevOps is too focused on ops. And I think that's very interesting, and it kind of goes back to this clash of perspectives, this clash of where everything is centered in the conversation. You also see this pendulum swing back and forth in conversations, often in the same event, between focusing on people and then swinging the other way and focusing on technology, and different perspectives might think that that's too much of one or too much of the other. That you just heard the word socio-technical, which I've used many times over the last decade of DevOps conversations, or more than a decade now. So we're going to go and kind of explore some of these contradictions through the lens of some. I'm going to introduce a little bit of some academic stuff that I've fallen in love with, that I've revisited all of DevOps really through this lens, and hopefully that'll be interesting language for you to use for. So we already said in the introduction that Dev and Ops is a bit of a contradiction. I'm not sure that's true, but in the reality of where we are today and the conversations we're having today, we separated those for various reasons. I don't think that's always the case in a lot of organizations. In fact, this is one of the things that I see quite frequently, and we'll come back to more specifics about it, is the developers and operators. DevOps means that all get smashed together in one group. I don't actually think that works very well, or advocate that, or that there's this new DevOps team in the middle. I don't think that works great either. But it can be an improvement on where you're at. So with this, I'm going to go, this is a callback, a shout back to the kind of like primordial DevOps conversations. And I did slides almost identical to this before DevOps was a word, talking about what I was calling at the time agile infrastructure conversation. So you have this traditional way that IT is siloed between Dev and Ops. You put a wall of confusion in between them, and I'm going to come back to that metaphor again. And then you only communicate through tickets or emails, and you don't even really see each other as human, and that tends to make people unhappy, or in some cases, maybe a little mischievous. And again, this is a callback, but I think this is where, and I spend a lot of time in the enterprise conversations now. A lot of the industry is still kind of in this model, and what I think DevOps represents to me is an evolution out of this model into something where we can, and Emily just used this word, take accountability, responsibility for delivering these things together. So there's also this dichotomy between people and technology, which I think is somewhat fallacious. I'm going to have my definition of DevOps at the end, but technology is people. There's no technology without people. That is our birthright as humans, to build tools. Like, that is what defines us as humans, is making tools. And to me, like the computers and the stuff that we're building with these abstractions, this is just a continuation of that. And the tools are for the people. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this other framing, how the people are for the tools as well. So introducing this idea that I got from one of my friends who works on my team now. He is studying basically the kind of like PhD academic framing of how organizations, cultures change their behavior from the new technology, and how the technology changed the behavior and the behavior changes the technology. And so this is language that I'm using from his research, and he's getting it, building on and referencing other research. So this is the language that was already in the literature. It's not language I'm inventing. I might have chosen different words, honestly, but we're going to go with the literature. So this is this core tension between the differentiation, what they call the differentiation economy, and the scale economy. And in this context, the economy is really about games, a game theoretic framing where there is some behavior and there's some payoff. And in the differentiation economy, the payoff is for creating innovation, where in the scale economy, the payoff is for creating standardization, for driving down costs, right? And so this is, in my opinion, kind of the core divide in a lot of the DevOps conversations between those people who get incentivized to change things, to create novelty, and those people who get incentivized to create stability, to create reliability, drive down costs, and get efficiencies. And that plays out at an individual level. It also plays out at the organizational level. So you have these these sort of organizational divides, this organizational tension, conflict between the developers who are trying to do all this stuff. They're literally paid to do new things, to change things. And then another side who is literally paid to keep things stable, right? And so you can see how those things are in tension with each other. And is there a way for both sides to win their game and also maybe help everyone else in the meantime? So this is from the language of the research, what is referred to as the scope economy. And the scope economy balances and keeps promises to both the differentiation and scale economy to enable innovation and efficiency. And it emerges, and this is why I fell in love with this language. And I think this is reflective of what I consider the best of my DevOps observations and experience. These scope economy constructs result from an ongoing negotiation between selfish interests in favor of the collective interests. And there's some other talks that like I really just focus on this framing and like building scope economies and like building platforms. We're not going to do that today, just in the interest of time and like moving on with the conversation. But it's an interesting framing to get, and I'm going to come back to it at least once more time, to think about like each of us have a selfish interest, you know, as individuals and as part of an organization, but then we are embedded in a larger organization that has a collective interest. And to what extent are we recognizing those other interests in our organization and how we all support a collective interest, a collective outcome, right? And so this is a pattern that I see over and over in a lot of like these attempts to build platform teams or DevOps teams. You know, you have on one side this mentality that we're going to have this platform, that we're going to build it. We're not the people who are going to use it. We're just going to build it, and we're going to tell all the people who are going to use it how they should use it. And I see this fail over and over. And you know, maybe in some cases there's enough of a iron rod to drive some adoption, but in a lot of cases, you just go back to that core tension. And organizations have, you know, the BUs have their own ideas about how to build some of this stuff, and they'll go around whatever, and then pretty soon they're shadow IT, and that's maybe good or bad depending on your perspective. So what I started saying is, if you build it, they will run. It's not they build it. If you build it, they will come. If you build it, they will run. They will come to build it, right? So getting that collective interest aligned. So it doesn't mean they're going to build it exactly how they want. Like you have to help them in some cases. They'll build it with you, but also recognize, this is the shadow IT thing, if you don't build it with them, for the collective, then at some point they're going to go around you. And I say that as someone who started my career as a developer. I believe that all people who come from kind of like development background, you know, talking about technical debt or all these other terminologies, you are constantly, and this is part of how you're incentivized, forced to make decisions between doing things right and doing things right now. So if you're not given the right thing as the easy thing, you're probably going to do the right now thing. And this goes back to recognizing, and this was called out in Emily's, but this language that I love is this social technical system, that you can't think about tech and people as separate systems. You have one system, whether you're talking about computers, whether you're talking about, you know, cars, whether you're talking about the landscape and all these interactions that people have. We are one system. You have to, if you want to be a system thinker, it's the inputs and outputs at all of these levels interacting with each other, not just the tech as a separate system from the people. They are one system. That's what's going to give you these reliable systems, is the social aspect. There's no organization in the world that believes that you can automate your way to reliability, right? There's the best in the world, arguably, is Google. They do not think they can get rid of SREs and have reliable systems. So with that, another contradiction, and this is something that I see people argue over and over, is this like notion of faster and safer. We can't do that. It's not unsafe, or I mean, it is unsafe. You know, we have all these things in this process to make us go slow because that's safer. And that is just provably false. The data has been out there for a long time that going slower isn't necessarily safer, but I also see this cause people problems. The goal should not just be to go faster for faster's sake. The goal should be to go better, and that you're going to get faster from going better. And this is, you know, people refer to this in kind of like martial arts or military setting, that going slow is smooth and smooth is fast, and getting the flow and those systems in place so that you have that consistency is what's going to give you the speed over time, not just putting hydraulic pressure to do more deploys per day. So there's some other dichotomies, some other contradictions, and this is something that you see many times. Again, for the interest of time, I'm not going to go deep into each one of these contradictions, but I think there is a tension, and I feel this in my own career, and I see this in a lot of people that I work with, between learning and doing, right? And this is, or being and doing, like the Sanghi stuff is reference to that. You learn by doing, but at the same time, if you're just learning all the time and you're not doing, it becomes kind of like this academic thing that you can't apply. If you're just doing all the time and you're not learning, you're not aware of everything that's evolving around you, then that's suboptimal as well, and you're kind of trapping yourself into this little pocket of understanding that you have no way of getting out of. Another tension that you see, or contradiction that you see, is old versus new. And you see this conversation play out in lots of different ways. And there's a search for novelty, and I see the value in some ways of adding new buzzwords, right? If you had a DevOps initiative and that didn't work out very well, and now you have an SRE initiative that's funded and that's getting you somewhere, like that's cool. You know, and then you have the observability people, and you have the chaos engineering people, and there are all these little subgenres of DevOps, or things we used to talk about in the very first DevOps days. At the same time, like those are all interrelated. That's a single social technical system, and figuring out how to kind of reconcile and get all those things to work together. I love all of those in their own right. At the same time, if you go into your organization and a different person owns DevOps, and a different person owns SRE, and a different person owns microservices, and a different silo owns continuous delivery, then you're probably going to have a bad time. And there's a value to recognizing how we did things before, and keeping some of that, because we're not all supposed to be building these cloud native things. Like there's some core value that your organization probably provides, some advantages that it probably has from being rooted in those old things, and you don't necessarily want to lose that. So figuring out how that social technical system adapts to the opportunities to take advantage of those qualities that you have from the past, while augmenting that with the capabilities that are new. This is another one that I see over and over that is a very interesting dynamic, which is this, that I think there's certain lessons that you can't learn until you experience it firsthand. At the same time, you don't necessarily need to learn every single lesson the hard way from first principles. And so finding a balance between bringing outside information that has some expertise that might help you with the fact that you are hopefully smart, capable individual in a smart, capable organization, and you can learn things by doing those things, right? So that goes back to the learning and doing cycles. Now this is there's a little interesting dynamic here. So this is that, and you're watching a conference, and maybe you've seen some other conferences. I think there's this interesting dynamic where we try to project our best selves and our best kind of like vision for the future and the possibilities, and then there's the mud and blood and the reality of the work that we have to do. And you get into the conversations with people who are on the inside of, pick your favorite company that you think does this well, and they'll tell you horror stories about how it actually worked or didn't quite work, in that context. And there's not a company you can name that doesn't have horror stories. Also, this is the same person, and that might be me. It also might be you, but it's definitely me. So laugh and cry. So this is a little bit of a transition to kind of expand and hopefully this lands where I wanted to. But you basically have this what I consider a bit of a straw man argument that like silos are bad. I don't necessarily think silos are bad. I think that silos that are totally independent with no meaningful feedback loops that are going to align those incentives with the collective outcomes are bad. But silos are actually good when you consider what it takes to be contributing to all of these different pieces of the tech that we're delivering. So at the point we're at now, the tech stacks are deep and they are wide. And depending on what you own, you might be an expert, but there's just no way you can be an expert in all parts of all systems. And so you have to be dependent on other people's expertise. And if they're all in one team, and just trying to understand that and the coordination costs can be very, very great, especially as you get to greater and greater scale. So you have to figure out how to balance the necessary expertise that you're going to invest in with the kind of feedback loops and the management structure that's needed to keep those in that optimal alignment for the collective outcomes. So I sort of referenced this in comments earlier, that you see this pattern where people are building these silos. And so this is like a Twitter post from a while ago, me being silly on Twitter. If you build a DevOps silo separate from an SRE silo, you might be an enterprise. And this is, I started saying, if you show me your org chart and your funding model, I'll guarantee what's going to be hard for you to do, what's going to be hard for you to change. And I haven't lost that bet yet. The models, when you see this, it's often because of what I just described. The org charts, the funding models, and those incentives are not aligned between these two groups. And with that, you get extra points if those two groups, your SRE groups and your DevOps groups, silos, if you will, don't work together. And then my friend and colleague and coworker, second-time coworker, said, you forgot the DevSecOps team. It's like, oh, well, I actually didn't. And this is an interesting kind of ongoing argument about, what was security in DevOps from the very beginning? And I will usually argue yes, unless I want to take the other side of the argument. And that has to do with my perspective and where I was and the people that were involved in the puppet community. And there was a lot of security researchers. There was a lot of work that went on to policy and some of these things. James Turnbull came from a bank, and so like a lot of my early formative conversations about DevOps and automation were specifically focused on security. So I think that is not necessarily true for me, but I do think there's a value to explicitly calling out security to bring the new people who thought they were excluded into the party. So these contradictions are not just binary. We have multiple walls or multiple kind of misalignments in understanding in our selfish interests across the organization. So these walls of confusion exist, and you could build the whole maze, right? Like you could put QA and sales and marketing and put walls in between all of them in most organizations, right? The other thing I want people to keep in mind is there's this spectrum of criticality where lots of these DevOps conversations started in a world where the problem they're trying to solve is how do you put cat pictures on the internet? And as you come along the spectrum to places where the focus is on financial things or where you get to the focus is on life and death, the process and what you need to do to put pictures on the internet might not be the same as what you need to do to preserve life. So I have this thing where I like to make something really big to make a point. So ongoing negotiation between selfish interests in favor of the collective. Say it again with me. Ongoing negotiation in favor of the collective. And then one last time, in favor of the collective. So this is the Pareto inefficient Nash equilibrium you are looking for. If you don't know what that means, that's a reference to probably what I consider my favorite talk I ever gave. I think there's still a lot of truth and wisdom in that talk from almost 10 years ago. So if you don't know what that is, ask your friends. And then I also want to point out that these dimensions, they're not just across, they're also up and down, right? So we have this world that we're moving into where we're trying to run software as a service on some platform, on some infrastructure. Those are all also services, which means, newsflash, those are also software, right? And a lot of my early kind of forays into what I was calling agile infrastructure was about bringing continuous integration to my infrastructure, to the code. Infrastructure is code applied to building VMs, configuring middleware, all those other things I was having problems with because I was a developer and I kept having, the difference between dev, test, and prod bring down stuff. And so I wanted to get that confidence and continuous integration that I enjoyed as a developer at the highest level on all those. So these are all in a different cycle, a life cycle, and you want to be thoughtful about the software development aspect, the development aspect, and the operational aspect. And then depending on your size and your shape and your propensity to build versus buy, if you're going to get to an SRE model, maybe there's a separate team that's running operations of the software. If you're going with the build it, they run it, Werner Vogel's model, then that's one team, right? But when Amazon says that in 2006, you build it and you run it, that's already built on APIs for doing deployment and APIs for doing provisioning. So be thoughtful about that. And speaking of non-binary, there's like all these other things that we already talked about, or I've seen some of the talks that have been presented to you. Certainly, I think I presented this exact image in Kiev a couple of years ago. But these things feed back on each other. These things enforce each other. And you can center the conversation on any one of these elements. And it's interesting and it's meaningful. It's not wrong. It's just incomplete. And you have to be thoughtful about how all these things reinforce each other. So coming to the end of this is a little bit of a shout out to a silly thing, but I thought it was like a nice image that you have this ability to make this shield and this weapon from those elements of culture, metrics, automation, lean and sharing. And my advice to you is to continually DevOps micro serverless, for all the buzzword bingo games you're trying to win. And this is my little definition of DevOps. So, and I hopefully get something from today that you can go try to accomplish this. Optimizing the human experience and performance of operating software and with humans. So I encourage you to use better tech, become better people, and stay safe out there. Thank you.
Wow, thank you as always for that high speed, trip in a zillion different directions at once, as we've come to expect from your talks over the years. Lots to dive into there, and I'm sure the questions are going to come fast and furious here in a moment. But I actually want to call out one of the comments from the chat. This is Jeff mentions this: slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Reminds me a lot of GPU optimizations and getting a game working smoothly and reliably. It's not about the highest frame rate. It's about the smoothest, most predictable performance, right? So it's not about going as fast as possible. It's about having the most predictable performance. Does that line up with kind of your smooth way of thinking?
So I think smooth is doing some heavy lifting in that, and I did lots of graphics work in some of my college, and what I mean here is slightly different in the sense that when you're so like this is a reference to something that people will talk about in like martial arts, jiu-jitsu circles, or like I think it initially comes from maybe the Navy SEALs or something, but the idea is that in order for you to go fast, you want to go faster, you have to go slower to get that smoothness. If you try to rush into going faster before you have the smoothness, you're never going to get to that optimal performance. So that comment from that person is not wrong, and I understand the context they're using smooth there, but you're actually in some cases trying to be faster, and then you could get into like the OODA loop and this notion of adversaries because you're trying to disrupt someone else's loop, right? So you want to be faster than they're capable of going.
Yeah, for sure, and that
Does that make sense?
makes sense, especially coming from martial arts. You know, I'm teaching people striking, for example. Everybody wants to go fast, everybody wants to hit hard, and I'm like, no, 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 you need to slow down and figure it out, and then we'll speed up from there. So that makes 100% sense. So again, you know, we're waiting for the questions to come in, but there's a lot here to touch on. And again, as with the previous talk, I was furiously writing down some notes. You mentioned a piece of terminology here, and I want to make sure everybody's on board with it. Coordination cost. What is coordination cost?
So, I mean, you can do like the graph theory version of this, or you could build up a different model of it. But if you think about a startup where you have 3 people and you're all kind of working and you all may be experts in different things, and you're like, hey, should we do this thing? And everyone's like, yeah. And your coordination cost is like everyone's in the same room, right? And then you add more and more nodes, and you can think about, you know, the n plus whatever version of all the different points that you have to contact if you're going to coordinate across the different expertise that you need to accomplish the mission. And so then at some point, and this is why you start to have management, you start to have some of these other abstractions, it makes more sense to have that essentially like human API be abstracted a bit instead of every node communicating with every other node.
Right, definitely makes
so
sense.
like as you
And
add
as you
more
said,
nodes to the system, go ahead.
please.
No, as you add more nodes to the system, it's just more and more expensive for every node to stay consistent with every other node.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly, exactly. Another couple of things that I thought was really interesting you touched on here was this idea of building for versus building with, right? You know, if you build something, you expect everybody to use it the way that you intended it to be used, that's going to fail. Uh, but how would you bring people on board on that, right? Like, say you're saying, okay, we're going to build a self-service Kubernetes thing. Okay, great, you're building a self-service Kubernetes thing, but the developers don't necessarily care about that. Where can you start having that discussion to bring those people into that
They
project?
do and they don't, and they should and they shouldn't. So I feel like central to the DevOps conversation, you always had this notion of open source communities, and a lot of the tools that are kind of tagged with the DevOps hashtag or whatever were born in this open source world. And I have very concrete examples of what I consider the best practice here, where the platform team, the platform building, is essentially running the building of the platform as an open source project internal to that organization. And so you have these Kubernetes abstractions, and then the developers can see the code and they can say, I wish it worked like this, and they can make pull requests against the code base. And then there's like the code review or whatever, your internal process to make it, you know, compliant and secure and the rest of that. And so then everyone's part of that software development lifecycle or that platform development lifecycle as a first-class citizen, not just as like something that's imposed on them.
Excellent. Yes, absolutely. Last thing I want to touch on here before we go, and I wrote this down. I want to make sure I get it right. Silos are actually good. We're 4 words you said in a row, which I think flies in the face of a lot of what has been written by the commentariat, the brain trust, the thought leaders of the internet world about DevOps. It's all about breaking down silos. If you could just sort of talk about that a little bit more, I'd like you to develop this idea that, you know what, silos, maybe not that bad.
So generals always fight the last war, and some of us have particularly deep scars from the way silos interacted in organizations we were part of. But if you think about an organism like our human body, right, and we have different systems in our system, right? We're a single entity, but inside of us we have a liver, we have heart, we have lungs. Each one of those has a job. Now, each of those, I'm very thankful that those stay somewhat separate, right? They have signaling mechanisms, they have hormones, they have all these feedback mechanisms between them. But if you take those cells from each of those and you mash them together in a pile, you don't necessarily have a healthy organism. In fact, if you have an undifferentiated mass of cells, they're just kind of all trying to do whatever together, we have a word for that, and that is cancer. That's a tumor, right? And so I feel like when you think about the health of a system, you do want to have some nice separation. You do want to have some nice responsibilities, but we're all accountable for that collective outcome, for that collective interest. And so I feel like, some of that was an over rotation to say, oh, silos are bad, but it's actually, you're going to lose capabilities and expertise if you just put everyone in one big dog pile.
Fair enough. All right. Well, again, as with every single speaker we've had so far, I really feel like we could just keep going here, but we can't. So, Andrew, thank you so much, rather, for coming out and sharing with us today. I always look forward to the content with you, and hope to see you again in person sometime soon.
Thanks for having me. Everyone, stay safe. You got to keep the trains on time. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you so much.
Bye.